see me? Where's Mike, Piper? We've been missing him for like forever. All right. This isn't going to work, but raise your hand for your daily Bible reader. Oh, there he is, finally. Now, if you need a quarterly, Barry has a handful. He'd be glad to hand you one. He's going to come down the aisle. Everything's back in rhythm again. We're going. This quarter, if you'll notice on the front of the book, we're studying preaching and ministry. And that's roughly what we're talking about week to week. If you were asked to list sermons recorded in the Bible, have you ever thought about that? You know, one of the first ones you'd probably come up with is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and 6. We could come up with that one pretty easily. Maybe if pushed, we'd say we could list Peter's sermon on Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, when the church started. Could probably come up with that one. I wouldn't have come up with today's lesson listing it as a sermon. Don't know that I'd ever thought about it before as a sermon. But that's the way, turns out, Chad Ramsey. I guess I didn't know Chad Ramsey was the writer of this book. But it turns out that's the way he thinks of it, as in Acts chapter 7, thinks about, and when you read through it, I guess it is, a sermon that Stephen gave. But literally, if it's considered a sermon, Stephen was preaching for his life. We're going to read a lot of it, and we're going to read the situation that brought it about. And you'll see what I mean, that he was preaching for his life. Let's turn to Acts chapter 2 or Acts chapter 6 and talk about the situation Stephen finds himself in, and the reason he's in this situation to begin with, in fact. The things that brought it about. The church is in its very infancy. Remember, it began on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. They got so close together. All these people from out of town and all that were converted, and they had nowhere to go. So the church pooled their resources, and they were living out of the same fund, basically. Acts chapter 6 verse 1 says, "Now at this time, while the disciples were increasing in number," the church is growing, probably in strength and in numbers, "a complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food." These Grecians, basically, to put it the way we would today, these Grecians were complaining that, hey, all the Jews are getting the food and we're not. Our widows need more help. So the apostles, who were already had to be covered up because they were the teachers, they were the mainstay of this church. They were, in your mind's eye, you can just imagine that they were having daily Bible studies with different people in their homes and just wherever someone would stand still long enough for them to hear, for them to get to teach them. So they say to the people, look, we can't stop what we're doing to serve food. So you go pick out 7 men. Look in verse 3. "Therefore, brethren, select from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, who we may put in charge of this task." So basically they say, go pick out 7 guys who you can trust, who deal well with people. Let them be over this program. That's what we'd refer to it today, isn't it? Let them be over the food program. Let them serve the Grecian women and anyone else that needs help. Sometimes we refer to these men as the first deacons. I don't know that that's necessarily what they were. They're certainly not referred to that here. But that's what they were doing. They were serving the church. They were serving the members. That was their job. Now, this is the first time we hear of Stephen. Stephen was a good man. Stephen was chosen by his peers. Go back to verse 3. Therefore, brethren, select from among you. People who knew him the best picked him out. He was full of the Spirit. That's what, again, verse 3. Pick out 7 men selected from you, full of the Spirit and of wisdom. He had a good reputation among the people he lived with and lived around. But let's read verse 8 through 15 of chapter 6 before we get into today's lesson. This is how he got in the place we're going to meet him. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and signs among the people. But some men from what was called the synagogue of the freedmen, including both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen. But they were unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. Now, these were Jewish men. Notice they were from the synagogues. These are Jewish men who were doing what they thought was right to some degree, but they went too far. They saw that they couldn't out-debate Stephen because he had the wisdom, and as we know, looking back, he had the truth. Verse 11 says, Then they secretly induced men to say, We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. Second time they've tried this, right? Remember they did this to Jesus? Paid somebody to testify against him falsely? Well, here they are again. They're inducing bad men to testify that they had heard Stephen speak blasphemous words. Just like with Jesus, it probably wasn't, they weren't testifying to things that weren't true. They had probably heard him say that the synagogue, the temple, were not all that important in religion. That wasn't part of worship. And just as a side note, you know how we run off down rabbit trails? Well, let me run off down a rabbit trail for a minute. One more time. There's nothing magical about this building we're in. Now, it's a great building. It's really comfortable, and I'm glad it's here this morning because it's cold outside and the wind's blowing. But God isn't in this building because it's His church building. The Jews had come to, I don't know that believe's the right word. The Jews had come to be comfortable with the fact that God was in the temple. God was in the synagogue because that was His house. We're going to, as we read through here in a few minutes, we're going to see that Stephen points out to these people that they were talking about how they would have said how important it was that Solomon built the temple for God. Well, God's in this building today, but the reason He's in this building today is because we're in this building today, and He's in us. And Stephen points out to them that God said Himself, I created this, not you. Don't be prideful because you built me this nice building and dedicated it to me. I'm the one that provided the stuff to build it from. I'm the one that gave you the strength to build it. So, back off the rabbit trail. Back to Stephen. In verse 12, and they stirred up the people, talking about the Jews. They stirred up all the other Jews and the elders and the scribes, and they came to him and dragged him away and brought him before the council. Now, we've heard of this council before. This is the Sanhedrin. This is the leaders of the Jewish people. Also, by the way, little side note, these were the most educated of the Jewish people. They were teaching other people how to be Jews. They were teaching other people what God had told them. They would have told you there's a Messiah coming. Well, Think about the time we're talking about. The Messiah had come. What did they do with the Messiah? They killed him. So again, when we get into what Stephen says to them, we're going to read that he points it out to them. They put forward, this is the Sanhedrin, they put forward false witnesses who said, "This man incessantly speaks against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down to us." Well, think about it. That's exactly what Jesus said. He was going to change the law. The old law's dead. The new law's come. And he mentioned the fact that the temple would be torn down. He prophesied that. And fixing their gaze on him, and all who were sitting in the council saw his face, talking about Stephen's face now, like the face of an angel. Stephen put up with all this, all these accusations, all the taunts and everything that went with it. And still, even after, I want you to notice at the end of this how it ends up. Even after all the things they put Stephen through, he's praying to God, and eventually he prays for them. I couldn't do that. We're told to pray for our enemies. It's a tough thing to do. It's easy to say in here this morning. That's a tough thing to do. So, when the Jews back him into a corner, Acts 7 verse 1, the high priest says, "Are these things so?" Remember how when Jesus was on trial, if you want to call it trial, and Herod says to him more than once, "Is this true? Did you say this? Did you claim to be the king of the Jews? Do you have no defense? Is there nothing you want to say?" And Jesus wouldn't answer him. Well, that's a whole lot the way the high priest is doing Stephen here. Are these things so? He's trying to get him to confess, so maybe it gets it off his conscience. I don't know. So, Stephen starts his defense. Now, for a preacher to be effective, you know good and well that he has to know his audience. He has to know what they need so he knows what to teach them. He has to know simple things like what language do they speak so he knows that he can communicate with them. Well, Stephen knew his audience really well. He was a Jew, they were Jews. He knew, he had the wisdom of God behind him, which that we've already talked more than once about having the Spirit. I honestly think one of the hardest jobs Edward has to have is trying to decide week to week what to talk about. You know, I don't mind when Michael's looking for volunteers to teach. I want to volunteer to teach because I don't want, if I was Michael, I wouldn't want to be in that position where I couldn't find anybody that would teach. But I can't stand that. You're teaching third Wednesday from now. Talk whatever you want to talk about. I can't do that. I can't handle that pressure. But if you'll give me a lesson and give me time to study it, I can do that. But Edward does it week after week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week. Comes up with something to say and how to say it. But Stephen knew his attackers. He knew they were Jews that did not like the apostles. They didn't like the fact that the apostles were preaching Christianity. They didn't like that they were furthering the work of Jesus the Nazarene. They were leading people away from the Jewish religion into this new thought, into the way it's referred to by Paul. So, when Stephen gets up and he starts talking, he begins with Abraham. What they would consider their seed, their father, their grandfather, whatever, their ancestor. So he goes from Abraham to Jacob to Joseph to Moses through David and Solomon. He talks about the temple, this thing that in the Jewish mind was a holy place. And he talks about how it's not the end all, the be all, whatever, the as important as they said or that they thought and taught that it was. Now, let's read from our lesson text this morning. It's just a small part of this sermon that Stephen, the way he answered these charges. And basically what he does, and the reason this lesson is called Stephen's Historical Survey, he starts with Abraham, goes through the history of the Jews, what they went through, being slaves in Egypt. Talks a little bit about the Ten Commandments, how they handled Moses being gone or mishandled Moses being gone. In a very quick chapter, he tells the history of the Jewish nation, hitting just the high spots. Again, he's addressing the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. It tells us that in verse 12. And then that he is being accused of blasphemy, verses 11 through 14. What we're going to see and what we're going to try to pick up on is their reaction to Stephen's accusations. And we're going to see that he convicted the Jewish leaders of rejecting and murdering Jesus, which we know they just had, and that their parents and those before them murdered the prophets that tried speaking to them and leading them. It's a case of one generation just followed after another in these sins. And if we're not careful, we get caught up in that same thing today. We make the same mistakes we saw people make years ago, and our children follow us, and it's just it's a generational thing. One after another after another. Now, on page 97 in the quarterly, or if you want to read it out of the Bible, Acts chapter 7, verses 37 through 53. If you will, read along with me, because this is, it gets a little thick. Verse 37, this is the Moses, so he's jumped ahead from Abraham. We're starting with Moses in our reading. This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. Moses is prophesying of Jesus. Moses realized there's the old law that Moses put forth, the Ten Commandments, all that. He realizes it's going to go away. I don't know that he realizes. Maybe that's not the right term. But God uses him to point out that that's all going to go away, and there's this other something coming. Something better, by the way. We know is looking back because we've got the hindsight to look back. But there's something better coming. And him you shall hear. Verse 38. This is he who in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers the one who received the living oracles to give us, whom our fathers would not obey but rejected. Here we go. The Jewish people reject the fact that, they were told, I'm going to provide for you in this land, this promised land, if all you've got to do is follow me. Simple as that. Justin mentioned this morning the lie that the devil told about eating from the tree of fruit of the fruit of tree. Anyway, life and knowledge. Well, that's the same thing here. God made the same deal. If you will just follow me, obey me, I'm going to provide for you in this land. I'm going to take you to this land and let you live in houses you didn't build, let you eat from groves and gardens that you didn't plant. All you got to do is follow me. But, verse 39, whom our fathers would not obey but rejected, in their hearts they turned back to Egypt. They wanted to go back to being slaves. They thought that was better. Saying to Aaron, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. He'd only been gone a couple of days. He'd gone up on top of the mountain. They saw him start up the hill. They knew where he was. And they made a calf in those days, offered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own lands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. Did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Rephaim, images which you made to worship. Can you see the irony in this? You made the idol, and now you're turning around and worshiping it like it's greater than you. You know where that idol came from. You made it. And still you're worshiping it. He points out that, go back a verse, they worshipped him, they offered the sacrifices, but then they turned around and you took up the tabernacle of Moloch. They were trying to stand with one foot in the world and one foot out of the world. They wanted to worship God, but they wanted to worship these idols that these other people taught them to. It's almost like they were compromising. Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness as he appointed, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he'd seen, which our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles, whom God drove out before the face of our fathers unto the days of David. Basically here he's reminding the Jews that, look, I took you into this land where I provided everything for you, and still your fathers rejected me. Verse 46, who found favor before God and asked to find a dwelling for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him a house. Here's the high point. If you ask a Jewish person, chances are they'd say, here's the high point of the Israel's history. Solomon builds this tabernacle and temple and christens it or whatever, dedicates it to the Lord. However, the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands, as the prophet says. Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will you build for me, says the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Has not my hand made all these things? Has my hand not made all these things? In other words, look, you all feel pretty good about what you did. I gave it to you to give to me. You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and in ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold of the coming of the Just One, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it. I gave you everything, and you rejected it. Now, the scary part of this is, how much of that could God say to us today? Is there anything that you have that God didn't give you? We're all that way, right? We think we're amassing wealth and we feel pretty good about ourselves, but the truth is it's because of God that we have this. And something could happen tomorrow and it all go away. Now, not a word that Stephen said was untrue. Look in Acts, to go just a little further. Acts chapter 7, verse 54. Now, when they heard this, they were cut to the quick, and they began gnashing their teeth at him. They were cut to the heart, one version says. The exact same wording that was used in Peter's sermon in Acts 2. You know about verse 37 or so, where it says they're cut to the heart, and they asked Peter, men and brethren, what shall we do? They were convicted by the fact that they were told that they had done wrong and that they had killed Jesus. Here we are a few days later, not very long later. I don't know if it was 2 weeks or a month, but a little while later, basically he's giving the same message, and it's completely different reaction. And the author points out that that's the way preaching is. With some people, it will convict them to do the right thing. With others, it will just make them mad. And apparently, in this case, it made them mad because in end of verse 54, they say they began gnashing their teeth at him. They got so mad they were grinding their teeth. And verse 55, here we see again what a good man Stephen was. But being full of the Holy Spirit, he gazed intently into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, behold, I see the heavens opened up and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice and covered their ears and rushed at them with one impulse. I can't remember what happened in something last week. Susan was saying something to me in the kitchen, and I didn't like what she was saying, so I took my hands and put them over my ears and went, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. You know what? I couldn't hear. Didn't stop her from saying whatever it was she was saying. That's basically what they did here. verse 58, when they had driven him out of the city, this is how mad they got. They drove him out of town and stoned him. When they had driven him out of the city, they began stoning him, and the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. They went on stoning Stephen as he called on the Lord and said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Would you have done this? If your neighbors had driven you out of town and were throwing rocks at you, would you get on your knees and pray for them? Then falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold the sin against them. And having said this, he fell asleep. This sounds like it was a bad day for Stephen. I mean, to be stoned to death by your fellow citizens can't be the way you want to go out, right? It had to be painful, had to be embarrassing, had to be bad. But it was Stephen's finest hour. It was such a fine hour that God peeled back the curtain of heaven and let him see up in heaven, and he could see the glory of God, it says. He could see Jesus standing at God's right side, and preachers love to point out that it says standing, as if he was standing and looking over the cloud to watch what was going on. That it was that emotional for him. Yes, Jack? But don't you know, no matter what, and I think this is why, this is Johnny's opinion, I should get away from the Bible. This has to be, when Paul was talking about I was the chief of sinners, he has to remember this day. I skipped that back up in verse 58. I skipped the back end of the verse. They had driven Stephen out of the city and were stoning him, and the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. It's the first time we hear of him. And then we go to 8 verse 1, like Jack said. It looked like a bad day for the church. The Jews openly, I used the word bribe, but the American Standard Version uses the words induced. I don't know that it was money they gave these men, but they somehow forced these men to testify against Stephen. To come out and say that he had said these blasphemous things. Well, the truth is he probably said the things. The truth is they were not blasphemous. But these religious leaders of the day, the people who were the most educated, they had the most power. They were in charge, at least they thought. Now, they were also in subjection to the Roman Empire, but still, they thought they were in charge, and they had the power to try Stephen, and still they used felonious means. They cheated to accuse Stephen of these things, and so they would have something to accuse him of. And all of this was an effort to put down this uprising, this spreading of the word, spreading of the good news, what we think of as the gospel today. They were, and we all want to think about motive. I think that's a human reaction. When we heard about the shooting at the church down at Antioch a little while back, I think that's one of the first things we think about is, what was this man's motive? I noticed Channel 5's having a thing on their news program tomorrow night where this cat is listening in to the man's phone calls to try to get a motive. Well, these people's motive was, I think, they didn't want to lose their power. They believed what they believed, and they couldn't be changed. We need to be careful that we don't get caught up in that. We need to study for ourselves and be able to answer for ourselves. Many times, now to go to the end of this, I told you it looked like it was Stephen's worst day. Well, it really wasn't. It was Stephen's best day. It looked like it was the church's worst day, but it really wasn't. We're going to go on and read chapter 8, verse 1. Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. These people, these 3,000 people and more, who had been the very bedrock of the church there in Jerusalem, were scattered. They ran because they were scared, and that sounds like it was a bad thing. But we know, looking back, it wasn't a bad thing. Because of that, other congregations were started, and the church got stronger. Looking back now, we can see God's wisdom in this. And I guess the reason I bring that up is to point out that there are times that things happen and we don't understand why. We can't understand why. And we ask each other and we look at each other and we shake our heads, I don't know. But years later, sometimes we can look back and see, hey, maybe that was for the best. And even if it wasn't, it was out of our control, and the best we can do is handle it as best we can. There are things that I cannot control. And I hate it. Because that's me. I want to control everything I can get my hands around. But there are times when we just have to turn it over to God. Why are you raising your head? I know that. I don't need you pointing your finger at me. We need to be able to turn it over to God. It is I started to say bone of contention. It's a point of great talking at my house. Who's a control nut? But still, we're all that way to some degree. We think we've got to help God, and God can't do it without us. Well, frankly, we know that's not true. God doesn't need our help. He was running this world long before I came along. And He'll be running it, if He wants to, continue it long after I'm gone. So we have to remember, and maybe that's a lesson, I know it's a lesson I need to learn more and more, but maybe that's a lesson we need to take home with us today, is at times we just have to pray and say, God, whatever, I'm going to try to do my best to help you. And that's all we can do, because it's out of our hands. Okay. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your paying attention in the comments.